Like all photometrics in 3ds Max, an exterior daylight shot must be exposure controlled. And when we created our mental ray sun and sky, we were prompted to enable MR photographic exposure with an exposure value of 15, which is conveniently set up for an outdoor daylight shot. Let's go and customize that now. Under Rendering, choose Exposure Control. And we could use the MR photographic exposure control, but I prefer switching over to the physical camera exposure control. And that will work perfectly with Mental Ray, and it will also work with other programs. So let's do that. We'll change the exposure control type to physical camera exposure control. As soon as we do that, our screen goes white because the exposure value has changed. Here's a tricky little switch. It says use physical camera controls if available. I want to disable that because it's taking the value from the physical camera in the scene. And I want to be able to set that value here. This exists so that you could have multiple physical cameras with different exposure values. But let's turn it off. And then set our global exposure value to 13 exposure values. Press Enter. And now we've got a pretty good idea in our viewport. And now we come to white balance. It's 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and we've got a default illuminant daylight setting here of 6500K. That's a setting that corresponds to a television or computer monitor. Let's set it manually. Set the temperature to 5500, which is a D55 standard, and press Enter. And our shot just became a little bit bluer as a result. All right, we won't really know what this looks like unless we do a proper rendering, but we're setting some initial values. We can do a test render and then come back here and adjust these if we want. Finally, we come to the tone mapping section, which is image control. Highlights is the amount of burn or the intensity of the hotspots. Midtones determines the strength of the mid-range tones in the shot. And shadows allows us to crush the blacks a little bit or push down the toe or pedestal. I'll set highlights to a value of 0.15, midtones at 0.45, and shadows I'll leave at 0.2. And now we've got a much richer looking rendering here in the viewport. Of course, there's no global illumination in the view. That will affect the lighting significantly. It will be at least a half stop brighter in the final rendering. All right, so let's give that a whirl. We'll do another test render. Click on Render Production. All right, our rendering is shaping up pretty nicely. And once again, because I've adjusted the color temperature, we've got a little bit of a blue cast here, but we have more controls available to us to adjust the color balance. We'll look at that in a minute. But first, I just want to check in on the exposure in this shot. As I look around, this spot here looks a little bit overexposed. It just seems blasted out. We can check to see if the shot is overexposed, if we're clipping or losing data in the highlights. Just click and hold the right mouse button and move it around in the rendered frame window, and you'll get a dialog popping up that tells you the values of the pixel underneath your cursor. And if you look at the bottom left, you will see a value that says mono. And there is a column labeled real. And the value we see on the screen right now is 0.985. And that's just below 1. If we see a value that goes above 1 for that mono value there, then we know that we're actually losing detail in the highlights. I'll move my cursor around now and see if that goes above 1. And in fact, it did go above 1 on some of these pixels. And that tells me that the shot's slightly overexposed, and I'll probably want to go back into the exposure control and adjust that a bit, maybe increase it by a tiny amount, make it maybe 13.1 or 13.2 to compensate. But this is not a final rendering. We're still going to work on the color here. So I just wanted to check in on that, and I'll need to check in on it multiple times as I go through, just to make sure that I'm never clipping the highlights. Okay, that's how we can set a baseline exposure using the physical exposure control module.